Good evening. Good evening. It's just like I'm teaching a class. Thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to introduce Rebecca Clarren, and I will do that in just a second. She's going to talk about her most recent work, The Cost of Free Land, Jews, Lakota, and an American Inheritance. We also have books for sale here too, so you are welcome to pick one up, maybe even get it signed after the talk. My name is Emmy Corey. I'm an assistant professor of religious studies here at Hendrix. It is my pleasure to introduce Rebecca tonight on behalf of the Steele Center. I'd like to begin tonight with a land acknowledgement on behalf of the Steele Center, with thanks to the Wingate Museum here on campus for paving the way for us with their own acknowledgement. The Steele Center at Hendrix College occupies the traditional homelands of the Osage, Quapaw, and Caddo. We offer respect and gratitude to the Indigenous peoples who have cared for the land over generations. As a community of learners within an academic institution, it's our responsibility to grow our own and others' understanding about the historical and ongoing context of this land and its inhabitants. We recognize the displacement of and atrocities against the Indigenous peoples who called this area home and those who passed through. We recognize continued oppression of our country's Native peoples and the role that higher education has played and continues to play in it. We strive to establish the Steele Center as a space for progressive change and to develop and nurture positive relationships with the Indigenous peoples in our region. The Marshall T. Steele Center for the Study of Religion and Philosophy is named for Dr. Marshall T. Steele, distinguished alumnus and president of the college from 1958 to 1969. The Steele Center was made possible by a bequest from Mrs. Ruth Vesey of Dermot, Arkansas. The purpose of the Steele Center is the enhancement of the college's academic study of the fields of religion and philosophy on and beyond the Hendrix campus. The Steele Center works to identify, clarify, and contribute to the emerging religious and philosophical issues of our time. Areas of emphasis include deep questions and perennial conversations in the liberal arts, the academic study of religion and philosophy, and interdisciplinary thinking about big questions across disciplines. In addition to lectures in the spring and fall, the Steele Center also hosts weekly discussions on different topics every Wednesday from 4:10 to 5:10 in Ellis Hall, just over here. They're free and open to the public. I'll take this moment to point out that this week's Wednesday discussion will actually be tomorrow. From 4:10, we're gonna call it Friday discussion, just for fun, from 4:10 to 5:10 in Ellis with the one and only Rebecca Clarren, so please do make plans to attend that. The Ben J. Altheimer Lecture on Judaism and Civil Rights, which brings us here tonight, was established to highlight the role of Judaism and the Jewish community in the pursuit of civil rights, including in Arkansas. The series is intended as a testament to the Ben J. Altheimer Foundation's interest in and support for education, social justice, and the critical discussion of related legal issues. In highlighting the relationship between Judaism and civil rights, the lecture series aims to inspire sensitive, critical reflection that will enable students and members of the community to learn from past successes and failures and to imagine what a truly civil society might be. Before I introduce Rebecca, there are a few individuals and organizations I'd also like to recognize tonight. We're thankful to representatives from the American Indian Center of Arkansas for being here. We're also thankful to the Sequoia National Research Center at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock for their guidance and consultation as we prepared for tonight. And also, as a side note, I do want to note that Aaron Fair, the Assistant Director and Archivist at the Sequoia Center, will be here this coming Wednesday, March 12th, to speak at the Steele Center actual Wednesday afternoon discussion. So please do come to that as well. We want to thank also Marcy Paul, the Executive Director of the Jewish Federation of Arkansas. We welcome you and other members of the Jewish community of Little Rock that are joining us tonight. We'd like to thank the Altheimer family for their support, and we'd also like to thank Dr. Marianne Tunnelbaum, who was hugely influential in bringing the Altheimer lecture series to the campus and has done a lot behind the scenes to get Rebecca here this year. There's also one other person who deserves a big old thank you, and that is Tammy Vanneman. Tammy is truly the hands and feet of the Steele Center. She's done a lot behind the scenes to make tonight work. She's accompanied by her crew, the Steele Center ambassadors, Ayla East and David Kamanga, and Humanities Student Assistant Cole Mandrell. They've all helped tonight run smoothly and will continue to help tonight run smoothly. So thank you guys, we couldn't do it without you guys. All right, everyone feels thanked, I hope. Thank you. So most people, if you know me and talk to me for more than 5 minutes, learn that I have a deep, unrelenting fear of ghosts. It's tornadoes, mice, ghosts. Those are my top 3. Arkansas has all 3. When students visit my office at the top of the stairs in Ellis for the first time, they often remark at how fun and homey the building is, and my response is almost always that it is a great place to be during the day. But you will not find me there after dark, and only a little bit of that is because of work-life balance. Admittedly, some of my trepidation with ghosts may come from watching one too many horror movies, but I think it goes a little bit deeper than that. So much of my work as a religious studies scholar is rooted in this perennial realization that we are all haunted. I'm certainly not unique in this. The work of humanists and countless others in higher education is, to some extent, to grapple with ghosts. We tell the stories that are hidden in plain sight, seeped into the soil, nestled beneath the floorboards, buried in the walls. We tell these stories because they matter, not just to those who experience them, but because they quite literally matter. They materialize in our everyday existence, in our interactions, whether we realize it or not. Rebecca Clarren, I am pleased to say, is a fellow grappler. The cost of free land confronts our ghosts. To borrow a phrase from the late, great Toni Morrison, it rips the veil over proceedings too terrible to relate. To use Clarren's language, it tells the truth, not just to God, but out loud to the entire community. And why tell the truth? Why tell the story? Because it's only through telling the truth that we can begin to fix things. To repair the ongoing harm of the dispossession of native land, we must recognize it. In The Cost of Free Land, Clarren doesn't just analyze a history of federal policies toward native land. She considers the way these policies materialize in the life of her family, who immigrated here from Russia in the midst of a brutal pogrom, and the Lakota Nation, who occupied the land her family would inherit. In doing so, she tells a rich, complex, deeply American, and deeply human story of ties that bind, constrain, and divide us. But those ties can also perhaps liberate us if we're willing to recognize them. I would be remiss if I didn't also note that Rebecca is a prize-winning journalist. She's written about the American West for over 2 decades. Her journalism has won the Hillman Prize for Magazine Journalism, an Alicia Patterson Foundation Fellowship, and 10 grants from the Fund for Investigative Journalism. Her work has appeared in Mother Jones, High Country News, The Nation, and Indian Country Today. Her debut novel, Kickdown, was shortlisted for the Penn Bellwether Prize, and her most recent book, The Reason We're Here, The Cost of Free Land, won the 2021 Whiting Creative Nonfiction Grant. She lives with her husband and 2 children in Portland, Oregon, but tonight she is right here in Conway at Hendrix with us. Rebecca, the floor is finally yours. We're so thrilled to welcome you and hear your story, but before I turn it over, I'll just say there's going to be time for question and answers at the end, so please have some good questions so we can get some good answers. And there will also be a reception just afterwards, so please do join us. Thank you all. Rebecca, welcome.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Oh yeah, you got it? Yeah. And thank you, Emmy, for that wonderful introduction. It has been so fun to be here today, and I got to sit in on Emmy's class this morning and speak with some of you who are students in that class, and it really restores my faith in humanity to be on college campuses and speak to students these days, and to see people be willing to engage with our ghosts, as you put it so beautifully. So without further ado, well, before I get started, if you're like me, when I come to things like this, I always want to know what I'm in store for. So just to let you know, I'm going to do a little talking. Is it too loud? Do you guys feel like it's really loud? Or are we good? The sound? It's okay. Okay. So I'm going to do a little talking. I'm going to read a little bit from the book. I'm going to share slides, photos that appear in the book, and talk about them. And then, as Emmy said, there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. So thank you again. Also, if you do buy a book, I have a special pen that my dad gave me, and I am happy to use it to sign your book. This book, The Cost of Free Land, it really started with 3 questions. What are the stories we tell in families and in nations? What are the stories we don't tell? And why don't we tell certain stories? I grew up hearing beloved by me stories about my Jewish homesteading ancestors on the South Dakota prairie. And we had what I like to think of as like our greatest hits. Maybe in your own families, you also have stories that people tell over and over again, the exact same way every time. So in my family, there was the one about my Uncle Louie who could stand on the back of a horse. Or another one, and I never really believed this story, but this is the story we tell, which is about one of my cousins who, when he was 5 years old, every morning he would clear a path from the claim shack to the outhouse of rattlesnakes. And then there's the story that the women in my family particularly love to tell, which I think says more about them than it does about the story, which is that in the winter in South Dakota, so it could be negative 40 degrees, my great-great-grandmother, Fagetka, she would send her daughters outside. One of her daughters was my great-grandmother, who I'm named after. She would arm them with an axe or a stick, and she would tell them to go crack the ice of the creek that ran behind the house. And then she herself, this keeps going in and out. Tech friends. She herself would strip naked and dunk herself in that freezing water. That was her mikvah, which for those of you who don't know what a mikvah is, it's a ritual that traditional religious Jewish women take to mark the end of their menstrual cycle. And yet for all the stories that we told and continue to tell about my ancestors' life on the South Dakota prairie, there were no stories about our Lakota neighbors. Where my family lived, what eventually would come to be an almost 6,000 acre cattle ranch by the 1950s, the closest Lakota reservation was only 13 miles away. And I know I live in Portland, Oregon. I never drive 13 miles in the course of a day. But at the time, when your closest neighbor back then was a mile away, that was a distance easily collapsed. That was a close area to you. And I think the fact that we never, growing up, we never talked about, I never heard about the Native people who lived near my family, that's instructive, right? Because equally as important as the stories we tell are those we don't. They both create and shape the myth of ourselves that we pass to future generations. I have, as Emmy said, I've been a journalist writing about the American West for basically my entire adult life, for something like 25 years. And throughout that time, I really tried to deepen whatever I was writing about with historical context, to try, honestly, to convey empathy and compassion. I always have thought of my job description really as how do you take federal policy, I said this today in class, how do you take seemingly really boring federal policy and law, but show how it plays out in the lives of individual people and families in ways that are anything but boring. And yet when it came to my own family's time on the South Dakota prairie, a time that I have come to see is very relevant to my life today, I maintained a blind spot for a very long time. And to give you a sense of the depth of that blind spot, I want to read to you from the very beginning of the book. So thank you for listening. 22, although at this point it's 23 years ago, while on a reporting trip to the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, I found myself sitting shotgun in a truck with a man who would later become president of the Oglala Sioux tribe. He was smoking weed. When he offered me some, I declined, hoping to indicate a level of professionalism that as a reporter visiting an Indigenous community for the first time, I certainly couldn't claim. We had driven off a dirt road and were parked at the top of a rise. Before us were green rolling hills and the flat plains beyond. It was gray outside. A herd of buffalo with their dark brown backs dotted the landscape. It is likely that I was wearing jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. Back then, this was more or less my uniform for reporting trips, as I believed that by wearing clothes with limited personality, I could signal to sources that my identity didn't matter. In my bag beside me were a camera, a DAT recorder, and my slim reporter's notebook with the binding at the top. I had one great question prepared, which I had learned from a This American Life comic book about how to be a reporter. My boss had told me to write down every single thing that I saw and heard and smelled, but I failed to record whether the man beside me in the truck smoked a pipe or rolled a joint, if he seemed very high, or how I felt about any of it. Sitting there in the small cab, I was uncomfortable with the quiet. I had yet to learn how to follow a source's lead. I had yet to learn so many things. In my nervousness, I decided to share something about myself. I told him that my family used to own land in South Dakota, that we'd had a ranch somewhere that everyone called Jew Flats. I told him I had an uncle named Bronco Lou. I remember thinking this might endear me to him, that this might make him see we had something in common. He was polite. He nodded. His smile was thin in a way I couldn't read. It would take me years to realize what my words would immediately mean to any Lakota citizen. The 9/11 attacks had taken place the week before I visited Pine Ridge. One evening while I was there, over a paper plate of food that was shared with me at a family gathering, I said something about the horror of the recent events in New York. Sitting beside me, a former American Indian movement activist stared at me, her mouth a flat line. She said, "Now you know what it feels like to be attacked and invaded. It's about time for Americans to understand how that feels." The day before, an Oglala elder had told me, "When I saw those people running through the streets with terror, I was reminded of my ancestors running in fear at Wounded Knee." Even then, I failed to connect certain dots, certain historic realities between her, the Lakota, and myself. All these years later, what stays with me from that reporting trip, what seems now to be the clear central narrative, appeared at the time to be only tangential to the article I was there to write. What continues in this book for many, many pages is what I've come to think of as an entangled history, the history of how federal policy played out in the lives of my ancestors and how those same policies impacted our Lakota neighbors. This is not by any means meant to be a definitive history of the Lakota Nation. It's really not even meant to be a definitive history of Jewish immigrants or of immigrants on the prairie. Instead, I think of them in this entangled way, and I told them in this way because I think if you learn this history at all, and many of us never did, the history of Jewish immigrants, the history of Native people. I mean, how many of you ever knew there were Jewish homesteaders on the prairie? If we learn them at all, we are mostly taught them in silos. And I believe that when you learn these histories separated, you really miss the depth of the injustice. You miss the clear intention of the United States creating law to benefit certain groups like my family at great harm to others. So because I wanted to write this book in as wide and as deep of a way as I could, to try and sort of counter what I felt like were prevailing narratives, and really to muddy those myths as much as I could, to complicate them. I did this interview at one point after the book came out with a Lakota journalist, and he told me, I'm probably gonna say this wrong, I don't usually talk about this, but it just occurred to me. He said the Lakota word that translates as holiness, when you really take apart what that word means, it means to complicate your thinking. It means to make you rethink what you thought you know, and so you see it in a new way. And I always think that's an incredible thing to think of as being the idea of holiness. And so, in any event, because I'm not trained as a historian, because I'm a reporter, this is a history book, but it was just as important to me as reporting on what happened in the past as to connect it to our lives today, to show the legacy of history. I think I write this in the book, that before working on this project, I really thought, I was taught in my schools growing up, that we are always walking away from history, that it's firmly and securely behind us. But after spending time with Indigenous elders, and frankly, after spending a lot more time reading Jewish texts, I understand now that the past is really threaded to this contemporary moment like thread through a seam. It's still right here. And in fact, I write in the book, Lakota language, there's no tense that's different from the past or right now. It's the language tense is before, including this moment, and the future, which I just love as this beautiful metaphor and representation for that idea. I would like to read to you from chapter 1, which shows that this book starts, because of that import of connecting as many dots as I could. The book doesn't begin in South Dakota, it begins in Russia, where my family was living before they came here. So thank you again for listening. To understand how a Jewish community ended up settling on Lakota land, we must begin in Odessa in the spring of 1881, when my great-great-grandfather, Harry Sinekin, was around 19 years old. It was unseasonably hot. In fields outside the city, crops were wilting. An economic downturn had left thousands of factory workers unemployed. People were hungry. A dry wind blew incessantly, raising dust and dirt that fell from the sky like ash. Months earlier, terrorists had assassinated the Russian Tsar Alexander II. Rumors boiled in the streets and the countryside blaming Jews. Though unfounded, the accusations flourished. Jews had long been reviled as different, as Christ killers. In early May, as out-of-work men spilled from taverns, they formed a mob and stormed the streets looking for Jews. Some later reported hearing the chants from blocks away, "The Jews, they drink our blood." Harry Sinekin, drawing on the survival instincts that would serve him well on the South Dakota prairie 2 decades later, dove under his bed as soon as he heard the angry rioters. If he was armed at all, it was at best with a kitchen knife, as it was illegal for Jews to own guns. Others would later recall having only rocks and slabs of wood with which to defend themselves. Harry heard men yelling. He heard the windows shattering. He heard the door crash to the ground. The mob smashed every mirror in the house. They broke all the furniture. And then Harry felt the heavy wooden bed frame crash onto his face. His nose broke. Blood was everywhere. The peasants or the soldiers, whoever they were, found him. They beat him. They broke every one of his ribs, set fire to the house, and left him for dead. The looting of Jewish shops and homes and the attacks on Jewish people continued in Odessa for 6 days. Such violence towards Jews was so common, so systemic in Eastern Europe that it had a name, pogrom, which comes from a Russian word that means both to destroy and to conquer. Somehow, Harry survived and escaped the burning house. For the rest of his life, he would suffer from the effects of the beating and smoke inhalation. Even so, he was lucky to be alive. This is an immigrant story. Like all immigrant stories of survival, of leaving the known world to flee to a new place, it begins with fear and relies on luck. My family stories about Harry have always followed a classic script. We highlight his pluck and how he overcame adversity on the road to opportunity. We fail to acknowledge the reverberations of our family's good fortune, or the fact that it came at the expense of others. So I'm going to share some slides now, if the technology will work. We'll see how it goes. So Harry leaves Odessa, never to return. We don't really know what happened to his father or his uncle. I pretty much assume they died in the pogrom. And Harry travels hundreds of miles back to where his mother is living in this shtetl called Kopulia. Shtetl is a Yiddish word that describes small villages where during this time in Russia in the 19th century, Jews were forced to live in certain parts of the area of the country. I'm going to share the name here today because it's so surprising as I travel around. Kapulya was a town of just a couple thousand people, but I can't tell you how many people I've met who also have ancestors from Kapulya. It was near what is today Minsk in what is today Belarus. And this photograph comes from Kapulya. Those are Harry's two oldest children. And it was probably taken in the 1890s. And I love this photograph because you can see their clothing, what they're wearing. You can see, I think you can see probably no matter where you're sitting, that there's some Yiddish written on the picture. I had that translated. It means the hinterish house or the back house. And Harry has come into his own a little bit. Life is going okay for Harry. Much better in a lot of ways than it was in Odessa. He's met Fagachka, they've gotten married, they have 6 children, and they have a thriving tinsmith shop. And this back house is maybe associated with the tinsmith house. Jews were excluded from the gold and silver guilds, those metals being deemed too fancy for Jews to work with, but they could work with tin. So he was making the cupolas of local churches and silverware, things like that. But life for Jews in the Pale Settlement was very uneasy. My cousin Kathy interviewed our Uncle Jack, one of Harry's sons, in the 80s, right before he died, and he told her children in Russia were afraid of 2 places, attics and basements, because that's where they would kill or kidnap the children. Jews were not allowed many certain jobs. Jews were not allowed to own land. And there was always a threat of another pogrom around the corner. So Harry's younger brother, in about 1880-ish, he joins the throngs of other Jews leaving Eastern Europe and coming to America, which at the time was really opening its doors to immigrants. And at some point, Harry leaves Russia and follows his brother to America. And so we think this photograph was a postcard that was sent to him in America so he could see what his children looked like. Now, Harry's brother, unlike so many Jews that come to America and stay in the East Coast or maybe come down to Arkansas by ship, he hated New York City, and he gets on a train and takes it as far as the railroad line will go, which at the time was Sioux City, Iowa. There were so many Jews from Kapulya already living in Sioux City by the time that Harry and his brother arrive. There was a synagogue called the Anshe Kapulya, named for their shtetl. And at some point, and they're working as peddlers. They have these, like a backpack of dry goods on their back that they're traveling throughout the countryside and selling these goods to farmers. At some point, Harry sees a sign that would have looked a little like this one. I got this from the Library of Congress. For those of you who can't read, it says, Indian land for sale, get a home of your own, perfect title, fine lands in the West. But what Harry and many other Jews living in Sioux City saw were signs advertising free land. Under the Homestead Act, people, mostly white people, and Jews were considered white, could get in on 160 free acres that was theirs to keep if they could do what was called proving up. Proving up meant improve upon the land. And you had 3 to 5 years to do this. Now, we now know that one of our best chances of combating climate change is the intact native prairie. But for the early white explorers who came to the Great Plains, they looked out on the prairie and saw a wasteland. And so they recommended and the United States government took them up on this idea that this area should be permanent Indian country. But they changed their mind in pretty short order, which I will get to in a few minutes. But for my family, that meant there was this 160 free acres that they could, if they could work hard enough and get a little lucky, they would have, for the first time in their family's lives of memory, land that they could keep. And to improve upon the land meant you were going to farm it and you were going to put a structure on the land. Here is how glamorous these structures were. That's a claim shack. The historian part of me was so thrilled when I finally figured out why were all the claim shacks this size? They're all 10 by 12. And I found this tiny reference which explained that this was a treeless prairie for the most part. So people are coming to this area and they have to haul their lumber from a mill. And these mills are about 70 miles away. And so this was one wagon load's worth of wood that could build a claim shack that was 10 by 12. The men in this photograph, some of them are my relatives, they are all Jews. The guy with those boots, that's my great-grandfather. There were 3 Senecan daughters and 3 Senecan sons. All 3 Senecan daughters married what is called Jew Flat, the homesteaders of Jew Flats. My family doesn't go to the prairie alone. Raise your hand if you've ever been to Wall Drug. Do you know what Wall Drug is out here? Wall Drug is this totally kitschy pharmacy drugstore in the middle of South Dakota. And when you're driving across South Dakota, hundreds of miles away from the drugstore, you start to see these signs advertising free water to stop at Wall Drug. It's really a nothing place, but it's a nice locator for those of you who've been, because where my family settles, what is known still to this day by locals as Jew Flats, even though no Jew has lived there for a very long time, is about 25 miles to the northwest of Wall Drug. So my family doesn't go alone. There's about 75-ish Jews that all together leave Sioux City and go up to Jew Flats and settle together in these non-contiguous homesteads. They all speak Yiddish. They all speak Yiddish with the same exact accent, as they all come from the same region of the Pale of Settlement that my family did. And I've learned that they were all sort of intermarried or distant cousins living together in what was sort of a new little shtetl on the prairie. This photograph I love so much, because why are their dresses so white? I don't understand. That's Vagetka, the one that's over to the furthest to my right. That's the woman who would dunk in the mikveh. And to her left is her oldest daughter, Fanny, and then a collection of children and grandchildren. My family learned very quickly that it is very hard to farm in a dry place. And so within a few years, they go in for cattle ranching. There are more photographs of their cows than there is of the children or the family dog. They love their cows so much. I don't know if you can tell, there's sort of a Quonset-like shape behind them, if you can see. That, I believe, by this point, when this photograph was taken, which I think was around 1913-ish, by this point they were living in a claim shack, but when they first got to the prairie, they were living in a home made not of wood, but of dirt. They literally had cut sawed bricks and made them into that house, which was incredibly dirty and a mess. When it would rain, it would make a puddle of mud on the floor. My Uncle Louis I found an article in the National Jewish News quoting him in the 1950s of him remembering living in this claim shack and shuddering at the memory. But for my family, this was amazing. My great-grandmother and her sister Rose, to the end of their lives, referred to South Dakota as the good earth. They told their children it made them feel American, it made them feel free to own land in South Dakota and to be successful at the homesteading experiment. This photograph is of the school. And I look at this picture and I see how much their lives have changed in such short order from when they lived in Russia. Here are Jews and non-Jews going to school together. There's boys and girls going to school together. You can see there's some writing over some of the people. My Uncle Louis, who could stand on the back of the horse, that's him to the far right. My great-grandmother Ruth, there's a little says Ruth, that's who I'm named after. It's my great-grandmother. Her sister Rose is behind her. So for my family, this was the American dream, that they were there, that they made it. And there's historians who have shown in their research that even those Jews and other immigrants that didn't make it just to try being homesteaders, even those who failed at building a house and having successful crops. It helped them shake off their suspect immigrant status. They looked like real Americans, like they belonged because they were working the land. I had, as I've mentioned, a lot of stories about my family there. I interviewed every single one of my mom's generation, all her cousins, all those 6 children of the Sinnekins, all their descendants, that were my mom's age and older, for just to hear what are the stories that exist in the family. And I come from a family that doesn't throw anything away. I describe in the book how at my great aunt Etta's house in Minneapolis, she just died in October, but her house was like our family museum. And in closets where many people keep food or coats, she had boxes and boxes of original family archival material. I had access to 30 day diaries that my great-grandmother had kept, tax returns from 1911, nightgowns that were 100 years old. And I can't tease her too much because I have a new project I'm working on, and I realized in my own attic I have the same amount of stuff. And because I had all of this information, and I also did a lot of archival newspaper research, I had created a lot of timelines, so I understood what was happening in my family's life when it was happening. But I also, because I've done a lot of investigative reporting, I wanted to drape all this story over something resembling a fact. And so that longing drove me to look at my family's land records. I went into the deeds office, and when it was the pandemic and I couldn't do this research myself, I hired a graduate student in history who did this for me. And she marched into the deeds office, and we collected every single deed on the land that my family owned in South Dakota, which, as I mentioned, went from 160 acres in about 1908-ish to about 6,000 in the 1950s. And then I pulled every single mortgage that my family took out on those tracts of land. And what I started to see was a pattern, that they would take this relatively small amount of money out, but they would use that money to start a new business that wasn't reliant on weather. My family gets very big in the saloon business in the Black Hills, which then they get very into bootlegging, as I read about later. They buy more land with these mortgages, or they move. They keep the land like a kind of ATM machine, but they move to cities where their children will have more educational opportunity. My family was by no means alone. This is sort of the building block of American capitalism, right? Is how do you use land to accrue wealth? As I pulled these records, I could see that all around them, their neighbors are filing the paperwork doing this too. This is what's happening. And I added up all the relatively small amounts of money my family gets off of this free land. Adjusted for inflation, that comes to $1.1 million of liquidity that is on offer to my family. Legal scholars today call the Homestead Act the single biggest piece of affirmative action for white people that America has ever passed because of the millions. There's something like 25% of American adults living today descend from homesteaders. There's as many as 90 million of us. And very, very few are people of color. There is a sociologist out of Brandeis University who wrote a book about wealth inequality in America, and he said, if you descend from homesteaders and you can send your children to college, if you can own a home, it's very likely you can afford to do that because of the intergenerational wealth accrued from getting that free land. And yet, all that land and that freedom and that benefit, it came at great cost to my family's Lakota neighbors. Has anyone ever seen this photograph before? Some of you are raising your hand. Those are buffalo skulls. And you can tell by how tall that tower is compared to the men in that. It's about probably 2 stories tall of buffalo skulls. So why am I showing you this photograph? In 1851, the Lakota Nation, which are living on and with the land that will, within short order, become my family's land, they sign a treaty with the United States government, and treaties are considered the highest law of the land. And they reserve that here's a map that I can show you. I know it's hard to see. This map is in the book, but the biggest line, basically, that land will be Lakota for forever. And yet, promises made become promises broken quite quickly, because right around at the same exact moment that this treaty is signed, California, with its raft of natural resources, becomes a state. And there is great interest on the part of the railroad companies to build a railroad line connecting California and its oranges and pine trees with the East Coast. But the railroad companies know that the cost of that long-haul traffic is not going to cover the cost of building and maintaining that rail line. And then, like today, corporations have a lot of power, and the railroads were the most powerful corporation of their time. And so the United States gets very involved with making it possible to build this railroad line. And inconveniently, they've just set aside all this land in the middle of where this railroad line would be for Lakota and other Native nations from the plains, that it will be theirs. Also inconveniently are the millions and millions of buffalo that live and travel across the Great Plains. Pretty hard to put a railroad through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pound animals that are traveling through. And so the United States, by clear intent, sets out to eradicate the buffalo. And so this photograph, showing you again, this was taken in 1892. And within just a few decades, maybe less, the United States exterminates millions of buffalo, so that by the time this photo is taken, there are about 300, maybe 500 buffalo left in all of North America. There was a famous U.S. Army general, I think, or maybe he was a colonel, don't quote me on this in this moment, he said to his men, "Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." Because there was a lot of knowledge on the part of the United States, knowing it wasn't just get the buffalo out of there so those animals would be gone for the railroads. The Lakota call themselves buffalo people. Where I come from in Portland, Native nations out there call themselves salmon people. And the Lakota considered themselves, their purpose in life was so connected to the buffalo. So much of their origin stories and legends of arrival into the world are connected to the buffalo. They would dispatch all aspects of the buffalo for ritual, for ceremony, for their economic reliance. It was literally what they made their homes and their clothing out of, what they ate. And so truly to kill all the buffalo was a way to also attempt to decimate Native people. I worked with a geographer out of Haskell University to study the treaties that the Lakota signed, because the way the treaties are written, it's not like this is X acreage is set aside for the Lakota. The way the treaties are written, it's like from the eastern edge of this mountain range to this river. But what we figured out together was that by the time my family are planting their first crop on the South Dakota Prairie in 1908, the Lakota are living on just 2% of what they had signed would be theirs in perpetuity less than 60 years earlier. It's such a dramatic change. And the smaller, darker parts of that map are Lakota land today. I write in the book and describe it wasn't just land taking that the United States did to the Lakota Nation to attempt to further eradicate Lakota connection to land, to make it easier then to take more land. The United States makes Native religion and tradition and ritual practice illegal, literally illegal. I have the original documents showing, or I have copies of them, of saying, and it lists all the things you could go to jail for, which included things like keeping your hair long or saying your prayers. And it's so strange, or getting divorced. At no point is my family on the South Dakota Prairie being asked to braid their last challah, change their last name, and stop speaking Yiddish. But that's kind of exactly what's being asked of their Lakota neighbors who are living only 13 miles away. And to me, what is the most awful, in an awful chapter of history, what is the most awful was the taking of Native children. And that's, of course, the boarding school history, where it was required by law that Native parents would allow the United States to take their children and school them intentionally very far away, because the thinking was, I'm sure most of you know this already, but the thinking was that they could only interrupt the culture, they could only eradicate this connection to land if people didn't see their families. And so children, only in the 1970s did this law change. It was 1973. And so this is a recent history that children wouldn't see their families for 9 months of the year, sometimes more. And this was seen, today we call this cultural genocide, this attempt to eradicate culture. When I was working on this book, I thought a lot about what did my family know about what's being done to their Lakota neighbors. I said this earlier today. What does it mean to survive oppression and come to this country and then become part of an oppressive system? And this book, I write a lot about an Indigenous elder named Judge Abby Abenanti. She is not Lakota, she's Yurok. She's Chief Justice of the Yurok Nation in Northern California. And before this book was even a book, I wrote a profile about her for The Nation magazine. And she really helped influence a lot of the ideas in the book. And at one point I was talking to her about this and I said, what do you think? Do you think my family knew? And she said, yeah, of course they knew. She said everyone knew what was happening to Indians. But then in what is totally her compassionate way, in the next breath she said to me, but when you're running for your life in terror, which is what your family was doing when they came to this country, you're not stopping to have a quick restorative justice conversation. She said, it's going to take several generations of not living with what we now call inherited trauma to step into this history and to think about it and grapple with it. She said, so it's right. You and your cousins and your brother, you didn't have to grow up with the dysfunction of what your elders did, which was passed down the challenges of being immigrants in my own family. She said, so it's right that you all step into this and take responsibility. And then she said another thing that really changed my life. She said, if you're going to tell this history, you really should grapple with it, which is a very Jewish thing to do. And she said, we know justice works best when it's done in a cultural context. It works better. It means more to them. So she told me to go study the Jews. What do the Jews say about how to respond to harm, even when you didn't directly commit, but something that you've benefited from? And that guidance, I'm really grateful I didn't have to do that study alone. My rabbi in Portland, Oregon, Benjamin Barnett, when I approached him to be like, I have no idea how to do this studying, he said, I'll do that with you. That studying will benefit our entire community. And so for 3 or more years, we did a regular practice called Havruta, which I'm going to try and attempt to do with those kids and whoever else wants to come tomorrow to our discussion group. Havruta means just study in pairs. And it's a way to be witnessed and a way to challenge each other's thinking. I want to read to you from one last place in the book, but before I do, I have to just introduce a few very important people. So this photograph is amazing to me. That's in the middle, that's my Uncle Louie, who could stand on the back of a horse. That's Bronco Lou. Even though I didn't grow up with stories about my ancestors and our Lakota neighbors, I grew up with these amazing photographs of my family posing with men dressed in Native regalia. I've learned that the men in that photograph are wearing Dakota beadwork, and that's Lake Sylvan, which is in the Black Hills. This photograph, also one of my favorites. It's so weird. What's going on here? That's my Uncle Jack, who is Harry's middle child. They're in a studio. I have at this point done so much archival research. I was so desperate to try and understand why this photograph was taken. I even was comparing the little carpet square, trying to find some studio where another photo showed up with this carpet square. But early in my research for this book, it was probably early 2019, I visited several different Lakota reservations, and tribal historians there identified the man in that photograph with my Uncle Jack as Joseph Whitebull. Joseph Whitebull is Sitting Bull's nephew. There's a whole book written about him called Warpath that was written in the 30s. And because I knew then the name Joseph Whitebull, a friend of mine, he had been a source for many years, but has become a friend, and he told me, oh, I know the Whitebull family. I used to be married into that family. And so my cousin Aviva and I showed up one day on Standing Rock and visited this man. This is Doug Whitebull. And the day we visited him at Elder Housing on Standing Rock, he said to us, I'm the oldest living descendant of the man in that photograph. And so the stories in this book, the specifics of the Lakota story, are told through the Whitebull family, as much as I am telling the Sinekin story as well. I know I told you earlier that in 1908, the Lakota are living on just 2% of the land that they had reserved would be theirs in perpetuity less than 60 years earlier. But it's not like at that point, the United States just stops taking Lakota land. You could argue that effort is ongoing, and I would say it will certainly continue in this current administration to very much be ongoing. When Doug was a child, this is a childhood photo of him and his sister Rita, his family lived on the banks of the Missouri River, on what was really the last best land on the Standing Rock Reservation. There were huge old-growth cottonwood trees and wild animals that would live in those trees, and little things, little mouse berries that they would eat in the winter, and native plants. And yet during World War II, the United States decides to set a series of federal dams on the Missouri River. This is done for flood control for cities that are downriver, but the impact of the dam is to flood many communities, and the biggest communities that bear the biggest brunt of that flooding, they're all Native. And hundreds of Native people, once again, have to leave their land and move inland. And where they moved to, I found in the congressional record, this Lakota elder said to some representatives of Congress, he said, where you have us living now, it's so dry that even the jackrabbit carries a lunchbox when he comes to visit. So I'm gonna read to you from a moment when Doug and I went back and visited what's left of his family's land on the Missouri. And thank you again for listening. Let's look at Doug while I read. This photo was taken 10 years ago, or maybe even, about 10 years ago, and it was taken for any of you who know South Dakota or North Dakota, it's in the town of Kennel, near their land. One day, Doug, myself, and one of Doug's former students, Jeff McLaughlin, drive out to visit what's left of the place where Doug grew up on the edge of the Missouri River. There aren't any roads to get there. Up and down over buttes, we off-road in an old minivan that Jeff calls his VUC. It's a truck and a van. Get it? He asks me with a quick, shy smile. Jeff, like many former students, calls Doug Lickshee, Lakota for uncle. As we near the cut bank far above the deep blue water, red chokecherries and wild plum cluster in the folds and creases of the land. When we reach the grassy slope where Doug used to run barefoot with his sisters, I ask him how it feels. Feels great. Feels like home, he says, closing his eyes under the bright sun. Swallows swoop through the sky. The air is filled with birdsong and the buzz of insects, the river, and the wind. But for the moment, I'm not noticing any of that. I'm distracted by our effort to touch the past. An old cemetery, fenced off and thick with chokecherry, has survived the flood. While it had been slated for removal, the water never got that high, and the feds, by neglect or delay, left it alone. Deep inside the thicket of wild plants are gravestones of Doug's relatives, and he is determined to visit. Getting there will require this blind old man who relies on his cane as if it were a third limb to do the equivalent of bushwhacking. I explained to Doug where to put his foot, how to hold on to my arm and Jeff's arm. I'm embarrassed to share this part, but it's what happened. On the audio file, you can hear my voice asking if this is a good idea, cautioning Doug to be careful. Jeff quietly helps Doug step over the wire fence. He gets a camp chair out of the van and sets it up in the shade in case Doug needs a break. I should have known better. By this point, I knew a lot of Doug's stories, especially his greatest hits, such as the time he, as a teenager, ran a 50-mile race, finishing with bloody feet. I knew about his time at boarding school, where he was repeatedly hit and kicked by his teachers, sometime with a wooden board across his bottom for the crime of speaking Lakota or not making his bed correctly. I knew he'd survived all that and become a straight-A student anyway. Not a person given to giving up, Doug slowly but steadily traverses the weedy expanse from the van to the graves deep in the middle of the cemetery. He never slows down, never complains. Standing as close as we can get to the old stones, the words in the marble etched in Lakota, I read the inscription aloud to Doug, and he translates. Here was Mary Whitebull, who died May 18, 1902, at the age of 4. The shade of the chokecherry makes patches across our faces. As Doug takes a moment to contemplate the graves, I'm struck again by the weight of his loss, of what has been taken from him and his family to ensure a specific brand of American progress. There's a debate described in the Talmud, which for those of you who don't know is an ancient Jewish book, between two rabbis over what should be done if it's discovered that a house or even a palace was built using a stolen beam as part of its foundation. One rabbi says the entire building must be demolished so that the beam can be returned to its original owners. The other rabbi, he says the building can remain standing if the full value of the beam is repaid. Both rabbis make it clear, as soon as it is known that the beam was stolen, those living in the house must do something. They must make amends. Our country was built on a stolen beam, Rabbi Sharon Brous of Los Angeles said in a 2017 sermon. To ignore this history and the legacy of this history diminishes the legitimacy and the power of this house, this nation. The money that has come to the Lakota was arguably never a fair trade for what was taken, rarely a deal negotiated without some degree of coercion, and the losses compound one another. The flooding of Doug's childhood home here on the banks of the Missouri, built on the taking of his father's land and his grandfather's and his father's before that. And what of everything else that was stolen? The years Doug spent in fear at boarding school, the state-mandated destruction of Lakota language, religion, and culture. What payment can be made to replace such a loss? Thank you so much. We're going to go to Q&A.
Testing.
Yeah, so we can run this one and you can answer this one.
Fireside chat. Any questions? Anyone want to get us started? Oh, sure.
Hi, my name is Veda, and I live in Little Rock, and I work at Beautywood Books.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks. I just wanted to say, I don't really have a question, but I just wanted to say, so the way you talked about residential schools was so beautiful, especially as like a non-native person speaking about it, because like as you were talking, my mama went to a residential school in Georgia, because a lot of people don't know that it was on the East Coast too. And like listening to non-natives like grapple, especially people who have experienced their own iteration of systemic oppression, and so how often like the colonizer uses other people's oppression to justify pain for other people and like the way they set each other up against each other. I just wanted to just like say like that was really beautiful to just like hear someone talk about it, because like it wasn't up until like 2 or 3 years ago that we were told like we were being gaslit about the whole thing. Like we were like, no, that didn't really happen the way you think it did. And so I just wanted to say thank you for saying that in front of all these people, you know.
Of course. Thank you so much for sharing. It's powerful that it was your grandmother. Right. This is such recent history. And for those of you who don't know, it really, we have only as a country, literally in the last, a few months ago, Biden was the first president to ever apologize for the federal boarding schools. We've only just, under the Biden administration, had an Indigenous Department of Interior head who launched some study into the boarding school era. It's such a painful history and chapter, and it has left a legacy to this day of, and it's not a monolith. Like I would be remiss in saying I have met people who went to boarding school who had an okay experience, but I have met so many more people who suffered incredible abuse and didn't learn how to be parents because they were being raised by nuns or soldiers, and so there's a legacy from that as well. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you so much. My name is Stephanie. I also live in Little Rock. I also am a scholar of Jewish studies, so really amazing. I also just came back from the West Bank, and I'm holding a lot of that while I'm in this room. And so part of what you were talking about is how do we think culturally of doing work in terms of repair? So I come back to this question of shuva, right?
Yes.
And so in relation to Jews as settlers, some of these questions, what does kind of in your experience doing this work, whether that's personal, professional, some of these pieces, what to you beyond just the first step if we think of the Rambam, right? The
Yes.
recognition of harm.
Totally.
But where do we, how do we go through those next steps
Yes.
of really committing as Jews to Shuva when we are living in a settler colony? For you, what does that look like?
Awesome question. So for those of you who don't know, this concept of tshuva, it translates literally as return. And my own rabbi talks about it as returning to the goodness of our nature. And this idea of repair is built into daily prayers for religious Jews. I mean, it's at every level and into the cycles of the way we engage with our religion. So during Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, our holiest days, we are steeped in this question of how do we do repair, how do we return? And I think relevant to this, as we talk about it in this moment, I was saying to the students in Emmy's class earlier, that the Jewish word for sin, for harm, is hate. But when you really translate it, this is what my rabbi has taught me, it's an archery term, which means to miss the mark, which I love because I think of sin and I feel like, oh God, but we all miss the mark. We're all human. And so the process of tshuva is this returning to, I missed the mark. How do I return to the goodness of my nature and approach it in a new way and take responsibility and move on? You also referenced Maimonides. So for those of you who don't know, Maimonides was a Jewish scholar hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago. He wrote out these steps of repentance. And he was a rabbi, he was a philosopher. The steps are so amazing because they totally hold up today. For those of you who want to do a real deep dive on Maimonides, there's a book by a rabbi named Danu Rettenberg called On Repentance and Repair that I would really recommend. And she's applying to how do we use these ideas and show how we can use them today in our lives. At all sorts of levels, in the justice system, in interpersonal ways. So, as you said, in those steps of repentance, which were really important to me in guiding my thinking, and I write about this in the book, you don't apologize until step 4, something like that, maybe 5. And the first step is to stop doing the harm. And the second step, as you mentioned, is to say the truth out loud. And so in many ways, this book is my effort to say the truth out loud. But I don't think, and I anticipate your question, it's not enough at all. I really don't think truth-telling and storytelling is very important, but it's definitely not enough. And those middle steps between apology and truth-telling, they're all about how do you change your nature to be a person who doesn't commit the same harm again, and how do you make it right for the person you have harmed. For me, that meant I had a lot of conversations with Indigenous elders about what would it help, what would make a difference. And it took a long time for anyone to really answer me. I think that's important. That's how relationships work, right? You have to trust someone to make yourself vulnerable enough to say, this is what would help me. And people said a lot of different things. And obviously I did not interview every single Lakota elder, so you're getting a very small slice of who I was in relationship with. But the things that were said to me were, it really matters. An apology really matters. That acknowledgement that this actually happened, as you were saying, that we're not being gaslit, that it wasn't happened. One elder said to me, I mean, they're saying all the time that it's just in history, and that it happened, it's sort of this idea, like, get over it. And someone said to me very directly, like, I can't really get over it if no one acknowledges that it has happened. And Doug Whitebull, probably the third time in 2 years that I had asked him very directly, like, what could my family do? He's a teacher, and he is a former, now retired, very beloved teacher in Lakota country. And he's a good teacher. He doesn't just say, this is what you should do. But he reminded me of ongoing efforts to buy up private land in the Black Hills. So for those of you who don't know, the Black Hills, what the Lakota call the oh my gosh, I'm forgetting in this moment the word. The Black Hills for the Lakota is as significant for them as Israel is for many Jews. It is where many rituals must be done. It is where their calendar is based. It's where their origin stories come from. And even the United States Supreme Court in 1980 ruled that the taking of the Black Hills was illegal. And at that time, the United States Supreme Court said, we owe you millions of dollars. And the Lakota said, we don't want your money, we want that land. 4 of the 10 poorest counties in America, based when this book came out, are the counties that our Lakota reservations are on. And those people don't want the over $1 billion that is now sitting because of interest in a federal bank. But most Lakota people I've met, they've said, we know the pain of displacement. We're not looking to displace others. We're not gonna get Detroit back, someone said to me, and we wouldn't want it. But as private land comes up for sale in the Black Hills, an organization called the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, which is Native-led, it's been around for 30 years, helping lots of Native nations get their land back. They have been buying up the land and holding it in trust for the entire Lakota Nation, regardless of what reservation they're from. And the Lakota people can go and use that land for ceremony. So based on that guidance, my family and I have created the Sehapa Land Recovery Fund. It is housed in the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. And I set our fundraising goal as $1.1 million because that's the value of that free land that we got. And we have not raised $1.1 million, but we have raised tens and tens of thousands of dollars. I think it's at $60,000 at this point. And it's been really amazing. Lots of members of my family have contributed, and lots of readers have been sending in money. And I am increasingly been really amazed at how the Jewish community throughout the country has been very eager to engage with my book, especially at a time when, as you all know, there is so much divisiveness in the Jewish community of how we are considering what's happening in Israel and Gaza. And yet, to kind of fascinatingly and to me very heartwarmingly, regardless of political stance about what's happening in the Middle East, uniformly Jews are wanting to engage with this question about native land dispossession. And many, many synagogues are starting to have conversations, including my own, about reparation around this issue. So I think that's a really long answer to your question, but thank you for asking it. Yeah.
We got one more.
I'll actually ask a question. So you mentioned land back, basically, and so can I just to contextualize for non-natives in the room? Land back is a political stance of like natives asking, and to get our land back. And you said one thing that was really important to me about how like, according to Indigenous philosophy, like our teachings would never let us like push people off of where they live, right? And you said that like the Jewish community, and particularly your synagogue, but just like pan-culturally, there seems to be this like wrestling with land back. And the Lakota Nation is one of the leaders in that process of land back. And then you talked about your family and the person saying like they understood where you came from being an immigrant. And so I was just gonna ask, because you talked to Lakota elders, what is your feeling about like the prophecy of Crazy Horse and like the 7th generation and just the cultural, like the pan-Indigenous cultural understanding of like this is a time of reckoning for all people who live in Turtle Island, basically about this moment, and how like that native elder was talking about, like when you've gone through trauma, you can't respond, but it takes time to come to grips, and how that kind of coincides with the 7th generation prophecy and the work that Lakota are doing to like lead all Native nations in this like process. You know, everybody in Indian country looks up to the Lakota Nation for just being one of the last people to capitulate. So I just... Yeah,
my friends have said and told me, you know, we were the most oppressed, the Lakota, and their land really, really, I mean, it's a weird argument to get, weird competition, who's the most oppressed, but I don't think anyone's exactly bragging about it, but they fought so hard, and they were sort of some of the last nations to really be impacted by terrible policies. I have to say, I don't think I'm the right person to talk about the
That's valid.
I think I would love for you to talk more about it. Clearly there is a need. I'm happy to say I think clearly there's a need for great reckoning, and I have to say, when I wrote this book, I'm writing about race in America, I really wasn't sure how it would be received, and I lost a lot of sleep. But I have been amazed at people's interest in engaging, as you are all here tonight, to be here and to be listening and opening your minds to this. So I think about what Faith Spotted Eagle, who's a Lakota elder, and I write this in the book, she said, when non-Native and Native people study the history of Native land dispossession together, it's really healing for Indigenous people, and for non-Native people, it's this freedom from denial. It's this chance to get out of denial, which I really love that so much. And there's actually, in the back of my book, there's a link to a YouTube clip where you can watch her talking about this. It's really beautiful. How are you on time? Good? We don't know, so we'll just stay here until you guys start leaving, it sounds like.
Were you, in your research or your family research, were you, was your family, as they homesteaded, were they ever confronted with Christian missionaries trying to come in and take over the land or try to proselytize?
Oh, I love that question. No, not really. Not that I know of. But they continue to be afraid, my family. So my family does two things at the same time. They are not being forced to assimilate like their Lakota neighbors are. They are voluntarily assimilating as fast as they can. And that's done absolutely, I think, out of fear of continued exile. They don't want to be kicked out of America like they were kicked out of, or, you know, made to feel like they should leave Russia. So they drop their accents. They are proud to drop their accents, to stop speaking. They don't let their children speak Yiddish. There's something I find fascinating, which is there's a lot of effort in the women in the family to start dyeing their hair blonde. So many women in my mom's generation get nose jobs that they all have the same nose, but they're all having nose jobs. And I learned that the vast majority of people that get nose jobs are the children of Holocaust survivors. This is driven by fear. And you know, there was incredible pressure for the men in the family to make it. Fagaka told her sons, you need to be multimillionaires in this family. Just a little pressure, you know, in this country. And again, I realized when I read the history of the Jews in Europe, that suddenly made sense to me, because you see over and over and over again, Jews continued exile, but wealthy Jews are often allowed to stay longer in certain countries, or before they're forced to convert, or whatever. So no, I don't think my family, I don't have any stories anyway of them being asked to converge or pressured, but they were internally pressuring themselves. They continued really strongly to maintain their Jewish religion, and I didn't mention earlier, they had a Torah on the prairie. They had, at one point, my great-grandfather Jake's brother lived with them, and he was a rabbi who'd trained at the Schlutz yeshiva, which was apparently a very big deal. And